I kind of find this hard to believe, but it's been over a year and a half since I did my initial impressions video of the base model M1 Mac Mini. And when I did that video, I was floored because not only was it the cheapest way at the time to get your hands on an Apple Silicon computer, but it was also destroying the i9 MacBook Pro that I had been using up until then. However, as the months went on, I realized that video editing needed more memory, and so I upgraded to the 16GB of RAM version of that same computer. And the video where I compared those two basically overnight became the most popular video on my channel, which was incredible. But if you've been following the channel for a little while, you'll know that the upgraded model of the Mac Mini that I bought and used for a year to run this entire channel has now been replaced with a Mac Studio. But the base model Mac Mini is still online in my little studio area and has been used daily since I transitioned it from an editing computer to where it lives now. So today, this is going to be my long-term review of the Mac Mini. No long-ish term like the Mac Studio. This is a legitimate long-term review of the base model M1 Mac Mini. So let's get started. Now, in case you're unfamiliar with the base model of the Mac Mini, it's 8GB of RAM and 256GB of storage. However, an interesting thing to note is that they never shipped a binned M1 chip in the Mac Mini. What a binned chip is something like the MacBook Air, where it comes with the 8 CPU cores, but only 7 GPU cores. That was never an option on this computer. You get the whole M1 chip, non-binned, straight out of the gate. Just an interesting tidbit. But even with the fact that you're getting the full M1 chip and all the impressive performance, a lot of people in the comment section of my initial impressions video were very quick to remind me that at the time in 2020, 8GB of RAM was a joke and 256GB of storage was not enough. So how's that been? Well, for the sake of this video, I actually have two different ways that I've been using my Mac Mini. The way that I've normally been using it, and then in this particular instance for this video, I used the Mac Mini in lieu of my iPad Pro, because for a lot of people, I feel like that's going to be the more traditional use case for this kind of computer. So we're going to talk about my normal use case first, and then we'll dive into what I would predict is going to be the traditional use case for this computer. For my personal use case, I imagine it's very different from a lot of other people's use cases, especially people buying a computer like this, because for my use case, I have this Mac Mini playing 3 different roles. It's a media server for my home. It's a video encoding tool that I also use to rip Blu-rays and convert them to whatever can be played in iTunes, and I use it to test beta software. So essentially, in one package, I have something that requires it to be always on and essentially never offline. I have another task that hits memory, storage, and the CPU with very long, very intense workloads, and I have software running on it that is very unstable and tends to be very, very heavy on the resources because nothing's optimized yet. So if you're looking for a worst case scenario for a computer like this, that's my daily workload for it. And I gotta say, it's handled it brilliantly. This thing has almost never gone offline. The only times I've had issues with software are when I'm running brand new betas of things, which is to be expected, and I will happily pull an entire season of Blu-rays onto my larger external connected drive and then have the computer compress them into something that can be played through iTunes, and it will spend days rendering hundreds of episodes, and it won't even bat an eye. In fact, it won't even get hot to the touch. That is extremely impressive. And because I live in such a small apartment, it's literally in the room that I sleep in, and the loudest part of that configuration when I'm doing tasks like that is the hard drive. It's nuts. But I did allude to the fact that I'm not using much of the internal storage because, well, it's a media server. So I have 2 14 terabyte drives connected to it on top of a small little flash storage drive underneath that's 1 terabyte, which is amazing to think that 1 terabyte of flash is small nowadays. But yeah, so the storage has never really been an issue because I've said it for years, my workflow, no matter what it is, doesn't put a whole lot on the internal drive. I put the essential files and essential programs on that internal storage drive, and everything else goes to something external that is either just as fast or a little bit slower, but is mainly used for archive storage. But some people pointed out, even in articles that I was reading, that having 8GB of RAM could kill the solid-state drive more quickly because it's constantly going to have to swap memory. And if you don't know what swapping is, it's where you run out of RAM, and so to keep the computer kind of able to open things, it will take unused tasks in RAM and dump it to the solid state drive, and then when it needs it again, it pulls it back. And this can wear on your solid state drive because there are a limited number of reads and writes on a drive. And in fact, I even pointed out in one of my videos about that same Mac Mini that it was swapping memory a lot when I was doing video tasks. I don't do that anymore. The biggest video task it gets is encoding, and that just means that it's taking in whatever I have on a drive, crunching it down to something more manageable, and spitting it back out to another drive. I have never seen that thing actually swap to memory more than a couple megabytes. But I'll get more into that later when we switch to the use case that I feel like would be more common on this machine. Hey, yeah, so Editor Garrett hopping in here real quick because I realized that in this entire video I forgot to talk about the port selection, and well, I figured now would be a good enough time to talk about it as any. And I pretty much did for the ports what I feel like a lot of people will do, both for weird use cases like mine and for the average user, which is I plugged in what I needed. For the few plugs where I didn't have enough, I got a hub, and I plugged in what I needed to the hub, and that was it. And it's just lived there now since I did that. And yeah, I do wish that it had 10 gigabit Ethernet, but when I bought it, that wasn't available. And even now, I'm only able to take advantage of 2.5 gigabyte speeds instead of full gigabit, or 10 gigabit rather. But overall, the connections are what they are. 2 USBs, 2 Thunderbolts, standard gigabit Ethernet, the headphone jack I never use, and honestly, for most users, that will be enough. For my weird use case, it's been more than enough because one of my drives has a USB hub on it, and for a lot of people, the connection they might need, they can get a hub for it, and for the connection that they don't need, they're probably never going to use it because they'll plug in what they need and forget it, and that'll be that. So overall, with the connectivity, it's good. I think for the average use case, it is more than enough. Maybe a little shy on the USBs, but overall, I think it's great. Anyway, that's all I wanted to say because I totally forgot to talk about it through the whole rest of the video. So yeah, we'll talk more about the average use case in a bit, but let's keep talking about my weird use case. Now, at the time of recording, this Mac Mini has been up for 10 days and 11 hours, and the only reason it's only been up for 10 days is because 10 days ago was when we got the update for the new version of macOS Ace Ventura. So, otherwise, it would have been on for way longer, but it resets the uptime every time you run an update and restart the computer. So honestly, for my use case, it's been perfect. It sits quietly back in my room with 2 massive hard drives connected to it and 1 smaller SSD. It distributes media to my Apple TV for home sharing. It has my archives for a lot of channel videos that I can pull from whenever I want. It has gigabit speeds, which are fine for the network I have, but that's the only thing I wish I would have gotten is 10 gigabit, but it wasn't available at the time, so you win some, you lose some. But for the use cases that I have, it's perfect because I have yet to have an issue that isn't caused by running beta software. And the funny thing is with this being the first and base model of Apple's M1 lineup, I get to see how the new version of macOS runs on what will eventually be the minimum requirement for the new versions of macOS. So it's kind of nice to see. Overall, for my extreme and very odd use case, this computer fits the bill perfectly. And honestly, I feel like if it weren't for the other type of use case that I'm going to talk about here in a minute, another great use case for these machines would be education, where the computer is almost never turned off and just needs to be hooked up to some accessories, potentially in a music classroom where having a color accurate screen isn't necessary, but having something that can handle a ton of audio files would be. That would be a really nice use case, or even something like a small-time data center, or at least some sort of little server distribution, like what I have here, but maybe a little bit bigger. That'd be perfect. I've even used it as a node for compressor, but the Mac Studio is so fast that like the time it takes to distribute the file out to the Mac Mini and get it back, the Mac Studio basically just ends up waiting, so it's not worth the time. But yeah, so that's my use case for this computer, and obviously I don't think that a lot of people are going to have this use case. I feel like it's fairly niche. So now let's talk about the kind of use case that I think this computer will be used for the most, which is getting into Apple products that aren't iPads or laptops. This scenario really isn't that uncommon. I saw it a lot when I was working at Best Buy, where somebody would come in and on the recommendation of their kids or their grandkids, they were told to get a Mac, and they didn't know a whole lot about Macs other than the fact that they were expensive, and they already had a monitor, a keyboard, and mouse from their HP Pavilion that had sat in that same space for the last 20 years and finally died. And so selling them a Mac Mini that was $700, dropping it right in place and having them just run whatever they wanted to run right then and there was extremely common. And because the Mac Mini just kind of sits on your desk and plugs into whatever you already have, it's a drop-in replacement for a lot of different computers if you already have that equipment. And if you're like me and spent a lot of money on the hardware that's already connected to your workspace, it's also beneficial because you don't have to be figuring out where an entire monitor is going to go with your computer, i.e. the iMac, or figuring out how you're going to close up and hide away your laptop whenever you're trying to use it as a desktop, i.e. the MacBook Pro. But I went for scenario one, somebody who is just looking to basically browse the web and check their emails and do iPad things, which it sounds funny to say iPad things because, you know, it's an iPad, but I used it for that whenever I had the urge to use my iPad. In fact, this script was written on that Mac Mini, and, well, it was fine. Now, granted, I spent a lot of time with resource monitors open while doing those things just to make sure there was no chance of anything sneaking under the radar like massive thermals from browsing the web or, you know, RAM going crazy and filling up and dumping everything into swap storage and killing the SSD from typing a text document. I'm being facetious here, but you see what I'm saying? A lot of times with these computers, you end up seeing a lot of people on YouTube talking about the performance. I'm guilty of it. My first video talking about this was talking about how impressive the performance was compared to an i9 MacBook Pro, their Pro machine. And I did an entire video comparing the raw performance of video editing between two Mac Minis. And I mean, that video is the most popular one on my channel, so that kind of content sells. But then everybody in the tech space who actually goes and searches out these videos doesn't realize that the average user is going to put this on its desk and never touch it again. And honestly, that's kind of what I'm doing even without the whole using it like an iPad replacement. It just sits in one place and it hasn't moved since I put it there. And it works as a server, and it's probably just going to work as a server until I need something bigger or it dies. And a lot of people are just going to put it on their desk and use it as a web browser, email checker, Facebook browser, whatever, and they're going to sit there and let it die eventually and replace it when it's dead. Sorry, I got a little off track there, but the point that I was trying to make towards the tail end of this video was that this machine, for all the things that people were worried about with swap memory killing the solid state drive or the storage not being enough or yeah, it's great, but how's it going to be in the long run and all those kind of things where upgrades will eventually kill it because it doesn't have enough storage. It's been a year and a half, so that's not saying that it's a 12-year out review of how it's handling it, but the way that this system has been running, even on beta software that is not finished by any stretch of the imagination, it barely did any swap, like kilobytes to megabytes worth of swap, maybe. The RAM barely ever got up to the point where it was less than a gigabyte of free memory, meaning it only ever used like 7 gigabytes of memory. And for web browsing and most of the stuff I did, it either auto-synced across the cloud or didn't touch the storage at all. At the end of the day, as I said, I am guilty of hyping the performance of this machine, but I wanted to bring it back down to earth and say that a lot of people, myself included, are going to buy one of these and put it somewhere hooked up to the keyboard, mouse, and monitor and just use it when they have to and never touch it until it dies and needs to be replaced. And that's pretty much been the case with every generation of Mac Mini. It's not uncommon, and if it ain't broke, don't fix it. Well, you can't fix it because you can't swap out the solid state, the RAM, or the anything, but that's beside the point. It's not dead yet, and it doesn't show any signs of being dead. So, with that being said, I hope you guys enjoyed this video. Let me know what you guys think. How do you think it's going to be 4 years from now when I come back to this Mac Mini? Will I still have the Mac Mini? I don't know. Let's find out. But hey, leave a comment, let me know what y'all think. Make sure to like and subscribe if you enjoy this content. I'm doing a whole lot more of it. And aside from that, I'll see you guys in the next video. Make sure to be there and have a good one.